It was the 13th of May, 1981. The air in St. Peter's Square was warm and thick with the scent of spring blossoms and devotion. Father Alessandro Bianchi stood near the edge of the colonnade, his black cassock absorbing the Roman sun. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the sea of over 20,000 faithful. They were a symphony of anticipation, their cheers rising as the open-topped Pope-mobile began its slow procession. Inside, a smiling figure in white, Pope John Paul II, waved to the crowd. To the world, Alessandro was a quiet, scholarly priest from the Vatican Secretariat of State, a man whose gentle demeanor and fluency in 6 languages had earned him a reputation for diligence and piety. A survivor of Soviet persecution, brought to Rome years ago, his story was one of faith triumphant over godless oppression. But as the white vehicle drew closer, the man known as Alessandro felt a cold dread snake up his spine. His true name was Dmitri Volkov, and he was a captain in the first chief directorate of the KGB. For 12 years, he had been the Kremlin's deepest and most successful penetration of its greatest ideological enemy. His mission was to listen, to report, to know. His handler's last coded message, received 2 nights prior through a burst transmission on a shortwave radio, had been chillingly simple. A storm is coming to the square. Observe protocol. Do not intervene. He saw a flicker of movement to his right. A young man with dark, intense eyes pushed through the crowd, his hand clutching something inside his jacket. Dmitri's training, honed over years of paranoia and observation, screamed at him. He knew the posture, the fanatical focus that blotted out the entire world except for the target. The man was not a pilgrim. He was a predator. Dmitri's heart hammered against his ribs. 12 years of meticulous work, of feigned prayers and genuine friendships, were about to be immolated in a single, violent act. He was a ghost, a non-person. Protocol was absolute. But as the Pope raised his hand to bless a child, Dmitri saw the face of another old man in his mind's eye, a man who called him son, who shared wine with him, who believed in the goodness of his soul. The Pope-mobile was now less than 20 meters away. The dark-eyed man raised his arm. Sunlight glinted off the steel of a Browning high-power pistol. Dmitri Volkov, the KGB captain, was frozen. But Father Alessandro Bianchi, the Vatican priest, felt a horrifying thought surface. I could have stopped this. 2 sharp cracks echoed across the square, scattering the pigeons. The man in white collapsed. The symphony of cheers curdled into a collective scream of terror and disbelief. And in that moment of chaos, Dmitri knew his carefully constructed world had just ended. From the shadowy corridors of the Lubyanka to the hallowed halls of the Apostolic Palace, the Cold War was a battle fought not just with missiles and armies, but with secrets and souls. It was a war of belief, and its most sacred battleground was the human heart. For decades, the Soviet Union saw the Vatican as a global command center for anti-communist sentiment, a spiritual empire with the power to inspire millions behind the Iron Curtain. To neutralize this threat, the KGB initiated its most audacious and blasphemous operation, to place one of its own at the very heart of the Holy See. This is the story of that agent, the man they called Icarus, and the 12 years he spent walking with God while serving the devil. The winter of 1968 was bitter in Moscow. 24-year-old Dmitri Volkov sat in a sterile, windowless room, a single file on the table before him. He was the top graduate of his class at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations, a linguistic prodigy with an eidetic memory and a fervent, almost religious belief in the communist cause. He had been raised to see the party as the one true church, the sole arbiter of history's righteous path. Across the table sat Colonel Ivan Morozov, a man whose face seemed carved from Siberian granite. He was a legend in Directorate S, the KGB's elite unit for illegals, deep cover agents who operated without diplomatic immunity. Morozov's job wasn't just to train spies. It was to deconstruct human beings and rebuild them into perfect instruments of the state. "Your file says you were orphaned during the Great Patriotic War," Morozov began, his voice a low rumble. "Raised in State Orphanage number 7. It also says your grandparents were practicing Catholics from a small village near Vilnius before the revolution corrected their thinking." Dmitri nodded, uncertain. This part of his history was a source of shame, a flaw in his otherwise perfect proletarian record. "This flaw," Morozov said, as if reading his mind, "is your greatest asset. We are not going to erase it. We are going to build upon it." The next 2 years were a brutal, systematic erasure of Dmitri Volkov. In his place, Alessandro Bianchi was born. The training was relentless. He was locked in a dacha outside Moscow, a place officially designated as a meteorological research station. His world shrank to his instructors. The first was Father Piotr, a stooped, broken man who had been a collaborating priest in Poland. Piotr taught him not just the catechism and the Latin Mass, but the cynicism of faith under duress. "Remember, my boy," Piotr would say, his breath smelling of cheap tobacco, "piety is a performance. The truly devout are too busy with God to notice the details. It is the doubters who study the script. You must be the most convincing doubter of all." He drilled Dmitri on the minutiae, the correct way to genuflect, the subtle cadence of the rosary, the precise theological arguments of Aquinas versus Augustine. One day, Dmitri faltered on a point of Eucharistic doctrine. Piotr slammed a heavy Bible on the table. "Careless. You think they won't test you? They will smell your hesitation like a wolf smells blood." Again. His second instructor was Morozov himself, who taught him the art of being a ghost. Tradecraft, dead drops, microphotography, the art of detecting surveillance in the reflection of a shop window. Morozov's methods were psychological. He would wake Dmitri in the middle of the night, shining a light in his face, screaming questions in Italian. "Who are you? Who sent you? Confess!" The goal was to make the Alessandro Bianchi legend an instinct, a bedrock truth deeper than memory. "They will strip you naked, spiritually," Morozov told him during their final session. "They will search for your soul. You must give them one to find, a soul full of suffering, of faith tested by our godless state. Make them pity you. Make them want to save you. Their compassion is the key that will unlock their kingdom." In 1970, Father Alessandro Bianchi, a thin, haunted-looking man with eyes that held a universe of manufactured sorrow, arrived at a refugee processing center in Trieste, Italy. His story of a persecuted Lithuanian Catholic family was flawless. Within months, he was in Rome, under the wing of a Vatican charity. His intelligence and piety were immediately apparent. He was a quick study, a humble servant, and a man who seemed to burn with a quiet, holy fire. The Vatican had found its symbol. The KGB had its agent. The Vatican is a city of whispers and ancient rituals, a labyrinth of marble and faith. For Dmitri, it was the perfect operational environment. He was assigned a minor role in the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. The work was mundane, translating reports on poverty in Latin America, drafting letters to bishops in Africa. It was the perfect cover. No one paid attention to the quiet priest in the corner. His first year was a masterclass in patience. He established a simple, predictable routine. Morning Mass at the Church of St. Anne, long hours in the library, a solitary evening meal in his small, Spartan room in the Domus Sanctae Marthae. He was building his legend, brick by painstaking brick. His first real mission came 6 months in. A coded message, hidden in the classifieds of a newspaper, instructed him to obtain a list of priests secretly being sent into Czechoslovakia. It was a low-level document, a test of his capabilities. Finding it required navigating the Vatican's Byzantine bureaucracy. He spent weeks cultivating a friendship with a lonely, aging clerk in the Secretariat of State, a man named Giorgio, who loved to complain about his rheumatism. Dmitri listened. He brought the man special herbal tea. One afternoon, citing the need to cross-reference a report, he asked Giorgio for access to a specific archive. While the old man was distracted, Dmitri used a Minox camera, no bigger than his thumb, to photograph the list. The dead drop was at the base of the Trevi fountain at precisely 3 a.m. He sealed the microfilm in a hollowed-out coin and, feigning a tourist's wish, tossed it into the water. A KGB cleaner, posing as a city worker, would retrieve it at dawn. As he walked back through the silent streets of Rome, he felt a surge of cold, professional triumph. He was all. Icarus was flying. His greatest success came through Cardinal Giuliano Albanelli, the elderly and kind-hearted prefect of the Congregation for the Clergy. Albanelli, a man of profound intellect and even more profound compassion, saw in Alessandro a kindred spirit. He was drawn to the young priest's supposed history of suffering. Their friendship began over a shared interest in the writings of Dostoevsky. "He understood the abyss, you see," the cardinal said one evening in his vast, book-lined study, a glass of deep red Barolo in his hand. "The battle between Christ and the Grand Inquisitor. It is the eternal struggle, faith against the seductive logic of power." Dmitri, who had studied Dostoevsky as part of his training to understand the Russian soul, nodded thoughtfully. The Inquisitor offered bread and security. He only asked for their freedom in return. The cardinal's eyes lit up. "Exactly. You understand. So many here are just administrators. You are a theologian of the heart." From that day on, the cardinal's door was always open. He saw Alessandro as a confidant, a son. He spoke freely of the internal politics of the Curia, of financial debates, of his private concerns. One night, after a particularly frustrating meeting, Albanelli confessed his worries about the Vatican Bank and its opaque dealings. Dmitri listened with feigned sympathy, memorizing every word. His report to Moscow that week was a bombshell, providing the KGB with an unprecedented inside look at the Vatican's financial vulnerabilities. But the relationship was a double-edged sword. Dmitri had been raised without affection, a ward of the state. The cardinal's genuine kindness was a foreign language he was learning to speak too well. One evening, suffering from a fever, Dmitri collapsed in the library. He awoke in his room to find Cardinal Albanelli sitting by his bed, bathing his forehead with a cool cloth. "Rest, my son," the old man whispered. "You carry too many burdens." In that moment, Dmitri felt a crack in the icy facade of his identity. It was a terrifying, unwelcome warmth. Morozov's warning echoed in his mind. Sentiment is gravity. It will pull you from the sky. When Cardinal Karol Wojtyła was elected Pope in 1978, the atmosphere in both the Vatican and the Kremlin changed overnight. Moscow was terrified. Dmitri's mission shifted from passive intelligence gathering to active infiltration of the new Pope's inner circle. The pressure was immense. Not everyone, however, was charmed by Father Alessandro. Captain Marco Rossi, the head of the Vatican Gendarmerie, was a man who operated on suspicion, not faith. He was a former officer in the Italian Carabinieri, a man with a bulldog's tenacity and an instinct for deceit. For years, Rossi had been troubled by a series of small but persistent intelligence leaks. Nothing major, but enough to suggest a slow, steady bleed. He began a quiet, methodical review of personnel who had arrived in the last decade. Father Alessandro Bianchi's file was pristine, almost too pristine. A hero of the faith, universally admired. Rossi disliked perfection. It was often a mask for something ugly. He noticed a tiny detail others had missed. In his initial debriefing report from 1970, Bianchi had used a specific Lithuanian colloquialism for potato that was common near Minsk, not Vilnius, where his family was supposedly from. It was nothing, a slip of the tongue. But for Rossi, it was a loose thread. He began a subtle background surveillance. He noted Alessandro's routines, his contacts. Everything was impeccable. The priest lived a life of Spartan simplicity. Rossi's men followed him for weeks. They found nothing, but Rossi was patient. He decided to play a longer game. One afternoon, Rossi accidentally bumped into Alessandro in a corridor. "Father Bianchi, a moment, if you please." He engaged him in a conversation about Lithuanian church history, a subject Rossi had spent the last week studying. He dropped names of obscure villages and martyred priests, watching for any flicker of recognition or confusion. Dmitri, drawing on his encyclopedic training, navigated the conversation flawlessly. But for a single, fleeting second when Rossi mentioned a non-existent monastery, Dmitri's eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation before he politely corrected the captain. Rossi saw it. It was the look of a man accessing a file, not a memory. The pressure mounted. Dmitri needed to get a document from the Pope's private study, a draft of a letter to the Polish bishops. It was his most daring mission yet. He knew the Pope would be meeting with Cardinal Albanelli that afternoon. He approached the cardinal beforehand, feigning a spiritual crisis. "Your Eminence, I am struggling. The darkness, sometimes it feels overwhelming. I feel my faith is a sham." The cardinal, deeply concerned, invited him to his study to talk after his meeting with the Holy Father. This was Dmitri's gambit. While Albanelli was with the Pope, Dmitri, citing the cardinal's invitation, was allowed past the Swiss guard into the anteroom of the papal apartments. He had less than 10 minutes. His hands shaking, he entered the cardinal's empty study, which adjoined the Pope's. The connecting door was almost always locked, but Dmitri had spent months observing that Albanelli, in his old age, was sometimes forgetful. He had prayed to a God he didn't believe in that today was one of those days. He tried the handle. It turned. He slipped inside the Pope's private study. The room smelled of old books and floor wax. He found the letter on the desk, photographed its pages in seconds, and was back in the cardinal's study when Albanelli returned, his face etched with concern for his troubled young friend. Dmitri had succeeded, but the risk had left him drenched in a cold sweat. A week later, Rossi requested a routine fire safety inspection of the clergy residences. It was a pretext. While his men checked extinguishers, Rossi entered Alessandro's room. It was monastic, barren. A bed, a desk, a crucifix. Rossi ran his hands under the desk, behind the bookshelf. Nothing. But as he was leaving, he noticed the crucifix on the wall. It was a simple, wooden cross. On a hunch, he lifted it. It was slightly heavier on one side. A professional's instinct told him it was hollow, but he had no authority to break it open. He placed it back on the wall, his suspicion now hardening into near certainty. The serpent was not just in the garden. It was hiding behind the cross. He returned to the 13th of May, 1981. The world had tilted on its axis. In the bloody aftermath in the square, Dmitri melted back into the panicked crowd, his face a mask of practiced horror. He returned to his small apartment and knelt, his body shaking uncontrollably. He wasn't praying. He was dismantling his crucifix. Inside, nestled in foam, were his camera, his cipher pads, and a single, tiny vial of fast-acting poison, his emergency exit. Captain Rossi's investigation went into overdrive. Dmitri's formal interview came 2 days later. He sat in Rossi's sparse office. "You were close, Father," Rossi said. "Did you see anything?" "Only chaos, Captain," Dmitri said, his voice steady. He gave a flawless performance of a terrified witness. Rossi leaned forward, his eyes like steel chips. "I reviewed the security footage. You were looking directly at the shooter's position seconds before he fired. You saw him, didn't you?" Dmitri's blood ran cold. "In the crush of the crowd, I saw many faces. I cannot say for certain." "I see," Rossi said, leaning back. "A man of God, and you failed to see a devil in your midst. How unfortunate." The interview was over, but Dmitri knew he was now a primary suspect. The hunter had him cornered. A few weeks later, he received his new directive. Plant disinformation suggesting the CIA was behind the attack. He approached Cardinal Albanelli, who was spending hours a day in the hospital chapel, praying for the Pope's recovery. Dmitri began cautiously, "Your Eminence, some are saying, the Americans, they have much to gain from instability in Poland." The cardinal, looking frail and ancient, turned to him. For the first time there was no warmth in his eyes, only a profound, bottomless sorrow. "Alessandro," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "the first casualty of evil is not life, it is truth. Do not partake in its second victory. I beg you." That was the moment the man named Dmitri Volkov died. The mission, the ideology, the years of deception, it all crumbled into ash. He had been sent to corrupt this place, but instead it had corrupted his certainty. He had to get out. His final message to Moscow was a single, coded phrase requesting immediate exfiltration. The mission was compromised, he claimed, not by Vatican security, but by his own soul. He vanished a month later. The official Vatican story was that the quiet, beloved Father Alessandro Bianchi had suffered a crisis of faith and returned to a life of quiet contemplation in a secluded monastery. Cardinal Albanelli was devastated. Captain Rossi knew the truth, or at least a version of it, but without a body or a confession. He could prove nothing. The ghost had simply disappeared. Dmitri Volkov was smuggled out of Italy and returned to a Moscow he barely recognized. He was not greeted as a hero. He was taken to a Lubyanka debriefing room, where he was interrogated for 6 weeks. Morozov, now a general, presided. "You were compromised," Morozov stated, his voice flat. "You became weak." "The mission was no longer tenable," Dmitri replied, his own voice sounding hollow. He was eventually cleared, but he was never trusted again. He was given a pension and a quiet desk job in the KGB's analysis department, a living relic of a bygone era. He spent his days translating foreign newspapers, a ghost in the machine he had once so brilliantly manipulated. The truth remained buried for over a decade, a secret locked away in the archives of a dying empire. Then, in 1996, a British historian named Dr. Alistair Finch was granted access to a trove of KGB files smuggled to the West. Finch was looking for information on Soviet policy towards Poland. He wasn't looking for a spy. But one night, deep in the archives, he found a heavily redacted file stamped with a single code name, Icarus. For months, Finch painstakingly cross-referenced the file with Vatican records, timelines, and personnel lists. He found mentions of a Lithuanian priest. He found reports containing details so specific they could only have come from someone in the Curia. The final piece of the puzzle was a defector's testimony mentioning a deep-cover agent who was pulled out of Rome in 1981. The timeline matched perfectly. Father Alessandro Bianchi was Icarus. Dr. Finch's book, The Serpent in the Garden, was a global sensation. It was a story almost too incredible to be true, yet it was supported by irrefutable evidence. The Vatican issued a terse statement, neither confirming nor denying the specifics, but acknowledging the harsh realities of that historical period. In a small, drab apartment on the outskirts of Moscow, an aging man with haunted eyes read the news reports on a flickering computer screen. Dmitri Volkov was now a relic from a war that no one remembered fighting. The party he had sacrificed his life for was gone. The ideology was a punchline. All that remained was the betrayal. He often thought of Cardinal Albanelli, who had passed away peacefully in his sleep years earlier, never knowing the truth. He wondered if, in the end, Rossi had ever told him of his suspicions. Dmitri hoped not. He hoped the old man's final memory of his son was one of shared faith and quiet conversations about Dostoevsky. One evening he saw a news report on television. It was from Rome. The church was celebrating the anniversary of Pope John Paul II's canonization. The camera panned across a vast crowd in St. Peter's Square, their faces lit by candles, their voices joined in a hymn. It was the same square, the same faith. The camera zoomed in on the balcony of the basilica, where the new pope stood, a distant figure in white. Dmitri watched, emotionless. He had been sent to that place as a weapon, designed to prove that faith was a weakness, an illusion to be exploited. But the weapon had broken. He had flown close to the sun, and the thing that had melted his wings was not the fire of God, but the unexpected, unbearable warmth of one good man's kindness. He turned off the television and sat alone in the dark, a ghost haunted not by the state he had served, but by the soul he had been forced to invent.